Okay. Now let's start with Professor Rita first, and then we will move on. We need to be a bit in a rush. So Professor Rita Kassa is from School of Education, Nazarbayev University, and she would be presenting today in our session. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I will try to share the screen now. And okay, let's see. Just a second. Okay, it worked. So thank you very much for being in the session, and I hope that I can move on speedy. It was a little stressful to get everything going, but so the topic of my talk today is university funding in the time of crisis and Kazakhstani approach to ensure access to affordable and quality higher education. So, and why is this relevant in the context of the topic of this conference theme? It has to do with Sustainable Development Goal 4, which focuses on education, and there is a target for 3, which specifically talks about higher education. So I will try to discuss this target in the context of Kazakhstan and what constitutes crisis for higher education, addressing concepts that build higher education funding, such as cost sharing, equitable access, and affordability. I will outline what has been Kazakhstan's approach so far to support equitable access and affordability in higher education, what is planned for the future, and what does COVID-19 has changed or has not for achieving this goal in the context of Kazakhstan. So now, as I mentioned, the United Nations Sustainable Goal 4 seeks to achieve inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And for Kazakhstan, this goal is one of the key priorities in the National Strategic Development Plan for the next 5 years. SDG contains 10 targets, but today I will focus, like I mentioned, on one of them, which is target for 3, which calls for equal access to affordable and quality tertiary education for all. And it also emphasizes that higher education should be made progressively free for all. Now, where does the crisis come in this context? First of all, higher education institutions all across the world are facing diverging trajectories of funding. So costs are constantly increasing. There is more and more investment in expensive technologies required. However, revenues do not meet this increase. So universities all over the globe need to struggle to, keep their balance sheets and to do what they need to do. And therefore they operate in most universities, with few exceptions maybe, operate in circumstances of an ongoing financial austerity. However, COVID-19, I believe, has created the situation even for the very wealthy universities that they are in the context of economic slowdown. Like yesterday, some speakers were saying, it's the whole world is experiencing this kind of situation. Thus, all the universities, even the rich ones, are very much affected with declining or slowing down economic situation. And why is that? It is because essentially higher education funding is a zero-sum game. There is an invariable amount of cost that is required to sustain operation of the universities, to have a certain quality of higher education. And costs are shared by 4 parties. One is government, taxpayers, essentially, because we fund the government, students, if they pay for their higher education, parents, if they pay for their children in higher education, and philanthropists, especially in the US. In Europe, this has been somewhat on the rise in post-Soviet space, Kazakhstan belongs to which. This is a new phenomenon. We still need to see how it's going to grow. And in the early 2000s, the concept of entrepreneurial university appeared, which gave at that time a lot of hope. How the universities will be able to diversify and generate additional revenues. The reality shows that empirical evidence shows that patenting activities actually are not quite as reliable income source as initially it was hoped. So at the end of the day, we stay again with these four parties that are supporting higher education financially. Now, if we talk about students in higher education and SDG goal to ensure progressively free higher education access for all, then there are a few concepts to clarify. So equity, what is accessibility, what is affordability? So if we talk about higher education, then equity means equality of opportunity. Basically that people of different socioeconomic standing have and other circumstances, they are taken into account to enable people to participate in higher education, to access it. Well, what does access mean? Access essentially means that students or who qualify for higher education can obtain funds to pay for higher education. The source of these funds can be different. It can be tuition, it can be student loan, it can be governmental scholarship. And this is where we come to the concept of affordability. So affordability is how cheap, let's say, for the student is higher education. So how much does the student pay for obtaining higher education after we subtract all the subsidies, all the governmental stipends, all subsidies for student loans and tax deductions and so on. So, as I mentioned, target 4.3 in SDG calls for progressively free provision of tertiary education. Two questions that are addressed differently in different countries but are relevant for any higher education system is it fair that taxpayers pay for all in higher education when there is a socially regressive flat tax rate like we have in Kazakhstan again? And is it fair that taxpayers pay for higher education for everybody, given that tendency that students in higher education tend to be overrepresented from higher income backgrounds? Now, different countries address these dilemmas in different ways in their policies. Now, what is the Kazakhstani approach? First of all, let me just outline the model of funding of Kazakhstan's higher education. So it's a voucher type funding, state grants. Students play a role where these state grants go, to which university. Public funding is distributed to students, and students then take them to the universities. It's also a dual track tuition policy. Why? Because universities admit students that are state grants funded and who pay tuition. And this dual track tuition policy concept has emerged essentially historically because at the time of Soviet Union, there were no tuition funded studies. With the independence, as the demand for higher education expanded, there was not enough money for the government to pay for all students who would qualify. So universities were allowed to start charging tuition. And this is how this dual track policy has come into being. And what is another characteristic of dual track tuition policy is that merit grants, public money to students, is distributed through merit-based grants. So you only need to do very well in order to qualify for the grant, and also the thresholds can depend on the context of qualification in programs that are more competitive, where more students want to go to study. There is a higher threshold to qualify for state funding. In programs that are not so popular or there are many grants, the thresholds tend to be lower. So how does this policy accommodate students who are disadvantaged by their social status? So what are the measures to support equity in higher education access in Kazakhstan? So Kazakhstani policy does recognize that there are students who will be inherently disadvantaged by inequality in compulsory education. And therefore, there are special admissions quotas to higher education for rural youth, Oralman or repatriate students in Kazakhstan, and students with disabilities and orphans. And so the way it works is that there is earmarked funding for the percentage of students from these groups in state grants, but also these students are able to qualify for the state grants with a lower UNT score or Unified National Test score, which is this merit-based criterion for students to qualify for the grant. So academic achievement is adjusted to reflect the the fact that there are inequalities in education quality on the preceding levels, and also there is funding that's earmarked for these groups of students. Now, has this significantly influenced ability of these student groups participate in higher education? Evidence from a wide survey that was conducted by information analytics